The funeral flowers are still fresh in the vase on my kitchen counter when she slides the papers across the table. White lilies, sweet and heavy, masking the faint odor of casserole dishes dropped off by neighbors. My black dress still clings to me, shoulders stiff from hours of forced embraces. My niece doesn't even wait for me to sit. She pushes the stack toward me, a pen balanced neatly on top. "Just sign these," she says, as if I've been expecting this moment. Her tone is brisk, almost bored, like a secretary rushing through paperwork before lunch. "It'll make things easier. Easier for whom I don't reach for the pen." My hands stay wrapped around the chipped coffee mug, its warmth the only thing grounding me. I trace the handle with my thumb, feeling the groove where the glaze wore thin years ago. My husband's mug. He'd sat here countless mornings, steam curling up from his black coffee newspaper, folded just so. Now he's gone, lowered into the ground only days ago. And already she's here with her clean fingernails and her clipped voice ready to tidy up my life like sweeping crumbs from a floor. "I'm not signing anything today," I say quietly. My voice surprises me. It doesn't tremble, though. My chest feels like it might cave in. She tilts her head, a quick jerk, a gesture she's copied from her mother. Her smile is thin, patronizing. "Auntie, you don't want to deal with all that paperwork. Trust me. This way, everything's handled. You won't have to worry. Trust me." The words taste bitter. The kitchen clock ticks behind her, loud enough to mark the silence that follows. I imagine the sound etching into the walls, another layer of memory this house will hold long after I'm gone. I've lived here for decades, cooked meals, celebrated birthdays, watched storms lash against these old windows. This house is not just wood and brick, it's breath and bone, grief and laughter. She doesn't see that. To her, it's square footage and resale value. "I'll think about it," I finally say. Her smile sharpens. "Don't take too long. Buyers are out there. This place could move quick." Buyers. As if my home is already on the auction block. When she leaves, the silence collapses around me like a wave. I stand in the doorway and watch her walk down the drive heels, clicking on the concrete. She doesn't look back. My hand lingers on the doorframe fingertips, pressing into the wood my father painted 50 years ago. It feels warm even though the air is cold. I don't know how long I stand there. The casserole smell fades, replaced by the faint trace of her perfume, synthetic sharp. It clings to the chair she sat in. I pull the papers closer, not to read them, but to see the way her pen had left a faint scratch on the top sheet where she pressed too hard. She expected me to comply. She came prepared for victory. I tuck the papers into the drawer beside the stove and push them out of sight. For now. That night, I walk through the mansion in bare feet, letting the floor creak under me. Each room greets me like an old companion. The living room, with its faded wallpaper, roses climbing in patterns long out of fashion. The dining room, where the table still bears scratches from years of family dinners. The upstairs hallway where my husband's footsteps once carried late at night when he couldn't sleep. But tonight, the rooms feel different. They are too quiet, too large. The echoes don't comfort me, they mock me. They remind me that grief is not just absence, but exposure. Every corner reveals what's missing: his laugh, my parents' voices, even the noise of children who never came. In the bedroom, I sit on the edge of the bed. The funeral program lies on the nightstand, a photo of him smiling at a summer picnic years ago. I press my thumb to his printed face, willing some of that warmth back into me. But all I feel is paper, old and confused. That's what she called me last week when I asked about the bills. The words replay, looping like a cruel song. Old, confused, as if widowhood stripped me of sense, as if grief erased the decades of careful choices I made. I whisper into the empty room. "I'm not confused. My voice catches, but it steadies as I say it again louder. I'm not confused. The windows are black mirrors reflecting me back, a woman in her early 60s, hair-streaked silver face, drawn but not broken. My eyes look tired, yes, but clear. Downstairs, the refrigerator hums. I hear the rattle of branches against the glass. The house lives around me, even when it feels like it's dying. I think of her words at the table. Buyers are out there. Did she mean she already has someone lined up? Did she think I wouldn't notice? The thought burns, but beneath the burn, something else stirs, a flicker of defiance. The night stretches long. I don't sleep. Instead, I walk the halls again and again, touching the walls, the door frames, the memories. Each touch is a vow. I will not be erased from this house, from my life, by her greed. When morning comes, I open the curtains wide. Sunlight floods the kitchen, illuminating the vase of lilies. Their petals are already browning at the edges. Beautiful, but fading fast. I stand at the counter, sipping coffee from his mug, and realize something. Grief is heavy, but shame is heavier. She tried to lay shame on me to make me feel incapable, irrelevant, weak. But I am still here. I still choose, and I choose not to sign. The clock ticks on, steady as breath. Somewhere outside, a car horn blares, a reminder that the world keeps moving. Inside this house, so will I. The papers remain in the drawer, but they are no longer a threat. They are a reminder, a beginning. I glance up the staircase. The rooms wait empty and echoing. But maybe emptiness is not just loss. Maybe it is space waiting for what comes next. The lilies bend toward the sunlight, fragile stems holding a weight they were never meant to carry. So do I. The days after the funeral stretched into one another like a gray ribbon, fraying at the edges. The house felt cavernous, louder in its silence than it ever had in the chaos of family dinners or sleepless nights. I wandered its halls without purpose, as if retracing my own history could tether me to something solid. Each room was an echo chamber. The living room still carried the faint indentation of my parents' old sofa, long since reupholstered, but never truly replaced. The dining room, with its faded wallpaper, bore scars of fork tines from restless children and rings from careless cups. My niece had never sat through those long evenings listening to my father's stories that drifted between truth and exaggeration. She had been a visitor, not a keeper, yet she called me old and confused, as though my memories were nothing but cobwebs to sweep away. At night, I found myself drifting upstairs, pausing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom. The air smelled faintly of cedar, the remnants of old wardrobes, though the room had been empty for years. I imagined their voices gentle and firm, reminding me of the promises I'd made to keep the house safe, to guard its walls as though they were family themselves. I had lived up to that vow, sacrificing vacations overtime, pay even friendships to be their caretaker when no one else volunteered. My niece rarely came, always with an excuse: school, work, a wedding. I never judged her then. I thought love was enough to bind us. I was wrong. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old bills, trying to keep my hands busy. My husband had always joked that I needed order to breathe, that balancing checkbooks was my version of prayer. The papers rustled, receipts yellowed at the edges, handwriting slanting in my familiar script. But among them, I found something else: my niece's writing. Her pen strokes were sharp, impatient, signing my name next to checks I didn't remember authorizing. The sight froze me. My breath stalled in my chest. She hadn't just brought me documents after the funeral. She had been watching me for years, inching closer, practicing her betrayal in small, quiet thefts. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the tile. My hand trembled as I held the check up to the light. There it was, her attempt at my looping E, her careless rush through the tail of my Y. My trust had become her practice ground. I pressed the check flat on the table, staring at it until the lines blurred. My heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about being erased. For days after that discovery, I moved through the house like a ghost. I lingered in doorways, tracing grooves in the wood with my fingertips. The mansion no longer felt like protection. It felt like a vault someone else was trying to crack. I heard her voice in every room echoing, "Buyers are out there." Her laughter on the phone haunted me, even when the line had long gone silent. Grief had hollowed me, but betrayal set me aflame. I felt it in the smallest moments, when the cashier handed me change at the grocery store, when my debit card swiped without issue, when I paid the electric bill with money I had earned. Every working transaction was a victory, a reminder that I was not helpless, not yet stripped of power. She wanted me to doubt myself, to surrender the deed, and shuffle away into irrelevance. I wouldn't. One afternoon, I returned from the store to find a business card wedged in my doorframe. A realtor's card. The name wasn't familiar, but the message was clear. She was circling. She had already told someone this house was hers to sell. My fingers curled around the card, crushing it in my palm, until the edges dug into my skin. That night, I sat in the empty dining room, a single lamp, casting weak light across the table. The realtor's card lay flat before me next to the forged check. Together, they formed a map of her ambition, each piece an arrow pointing toward the mansion's hollow future. But sitting there, I realized something else. She underestimated me. She thought grief made me blind. She thought loneliness made me pliable. She had forgotten who built this life, who kept it running while everyone else drifted. I was not some fragile relic to be brushed aside. I was the caretaker. My husband's voice came back to me, gentle as ever. "You always see it through, don't you?" He used to say that when I stayed late to balance ledgers or stayed up with my mother through her fever. I saw things through because no one else would. That hadn't changed. I took the forged check and the realtor's card, slid them into a manila folder, and wrote my name across the front. It wasn't a plan yet, just a beginning, but it steadied me. The next morning, I brewed coffee in his mug again. The lilies on the counter had browned petals curled inward. Their scent had soured heavy and sweet like rot. I lifted the vase, carried it to the back porch, and poured the water into the garden. The flowers collapsed, stems snapping under their own weight. I whispered, "Not everything deserves to stay." The house groaned as the heater kicked on a familiar sound, old bones stretching against the cold. I listened to it, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel swallowed by silence. I felt accompanied. That day, I began gathering deeds, tax receipts, and bank statements. I lined them on the dining room table in careful rows, each document like a soldier called to duty. I wasn't sure yet what battle I would fight, but I knew the house would not fall without resistance. The papers she pushed across the table at the funeral were still in the kitchen drawer, untouched. I hadn't forgotten them. I hadn't forgiven her either. But I no longer saw them as an ending. They were a warning. And warnings, if you listen closely, are also invitations. The invitation was clear. It was time to defend myself. I sat back in the dining chair, watching sunlight shift across the wallpaper, illuminating roses faded by decades of memory. My parents had chosen that pattern together, arguing over samples until they agreed. They never imagined it would become a witness to this fight. But I imagined them nodding now, quiet approval in their eyes. The house wasn't just walls. It was history promised sacrifice, and I would not sign it away. The empty rooms whispered back their agreement. The weeks blurred as though the calendar itself had dissolved into one long, heavy day. Every morning, I woke in the same house, but felt like I had crossed into unfamiliar terrain. The mansion that once held my family's laughter now confronted me with its emptiness. Even the air felt different then, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide what would happen next. I tried to occupy myself with routines, but the routines only led me back into memory. When I mopped the kitchen floor, I saw myself crouched in this same spot 20 years ago, wiping up soup my father had spilled when his hands began to tremble. When I folded laundry, I remembered draping warm towels over my mother's lap, her smile faint but grateful. My sacrifices were woven into these walls. I had given up promotions at work vacations with friends, and even the possibility of moving away all to be here when they needed me. My niece never saw those years. She was young then, too caught up in college parties, new jobs. I never resented her absence. I thought I was protecting her, that carrying the weight myself would give her the freedom to live her life. But now I understood the cruel irony in shielding her. I had erased myself. And she had grown accustomed to my invisibility. I sat one evening in the living room, the television on mute light flickering against the wallpaper. My eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on the photo of my parents on the mantel, my mother's hair set perfectly, my father's tie slightly crooked. Their faces were proud, certain. I wondered if they would have recognized the woman I had become, bowed, but not broken, tired, but not confused. As I studied their picture, I heard the echo of my niece's words, "Buyers are out there." It wasn't just casual talk. She was certain, maybe even rehearsed. She wanted me to believe the walls would soon belong to someone else. One morning, I decided to test her confidence. I stopped by the grocery store, my basket filled with nothing extravagant: milk, eggs, bread, apples. At the register, I slid my debit card through, holding my breath. For a moment, I feared the worst, that she had already found a way to drain my accounts. But the screen flashed, "Approved," and relief flooded me. It was such a small moment, an ordinary transaction, but it felt monumental. My card still worked. My money was still mine. That simple fact reminded me that not all the ground had been taken from beneath my feet. There was still a part of my life she hadn't reached. Yet, that night, as I put the groceries away, I thought of how betrayal doesn't always come as a single blow. Sometimes it creeps slow and calculated until you're cornered before you realize you've been hunted. She wasn't rushing. She was patient. She had already tested forging my signature on small checks. The house was her prize, but she was circling, waiting for me to surrender first. I wasn't going to. The next afternoon, I was walking past the study when I heard her voice float through the open window. I froze. She was standing in the driveway, phone pressed to her ear, unaware I was inside. Her tone was sharp, cocky, full of laughter that sounded nothing like the little girl I once read bedtime stories to. "Once the house is mine," she said, "I'll flip it fast. Auntie won't even notice. She doesn't know what's going on." Her words dropped like stones into my chest. I pressed myself against the wall, the wallpaper cool against my cheek, as if I needed something solid to keep me upright. She laughed again, a high, careless sound. "It's basically mine already. She's too far gone to stop me." I couldn't move until she drove away. Even then, I stood in the quiet study, my pulse thudding in my ears. I looked around the room at the shelves of books my father once read aloud from at the desk, where my mother wrote grocery lists in careful script. This room had been their sanctuary, their shared corner of the world. And now their granddaughter was plotting to strip it down to drywall and profit. I sank into the old armchair, the one my father favored, and pressed my hands against the worn fabric. Her laughter still rang in my head sharp as broken glass. I wanted to scream, to storm outside, to demand answers. But something in me held still. The stillness was not weakness. It was clarity. For years, I had defined myself through sacrifice, what I gave, what I carried, what I endured. I had worn invisibility like a second skin, convincing myself it was love. But in that moment, listening to her betrayal through the window, I realized sacrifice had become my silence. And silence was exactly what she was counting on. I sat in the chair until the light outside shifted from gold to blue shadows creeping across the floorboards. In the fading light, the house no longer looked fragile. It looked like a fortress. And I was no longer its prisoner. I was its defender. I rose and walked slowly through the rooms again, but this time, I wasn't tracing grief. I was measuring resolve. Each doorway, each stair, each cracked tile carried my fingerprints, my sweat, my care. She had not earned any of it, and she would not take it. Upstairs, I opened the hall closet and pulled out a box I hadn't touched since my husband's death. Inside were folders of deeds, tax receipts, insurance policies. My name, my signature, my history. I carried the box downstairs, set it on the dining table, and opened the first folder. The documents felt like bricks in my hands, weighty, undeniable. For the first time since the funeral, I felt steady. She could laugh into her phone boast about flipping houses, dismiss me as confused. But the truth was inked in these pages. The house was mine. The choice was mine. That night, I spread the documents across the table in neat rows. The chandelier overhead flickered dust motes, swirling in the air, as though the house itself exhaled. I didn't know yet what action I would take, but the path was forming. Grief had brought me to my knees. Betrayal had sharpened my edges. And now clarity had settled like a stone in my chest. I wasn't old and confused. I was waiting, and I was ready. I carried the folder of documents to the lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning, the air brittle with early frost. The courthouse square bustled with people going about their business, parents with strollers, lawyers in dark suits, clerks balancing coffee cups. I felt invisible among them, a widow in her 60s clutching a folder like a lifeline. Yet under my coat pocket, my pulse was steady, even strong. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I didn't, but something in my voice must have carried weight, because within 20 minutes, I was seated across from a man with kind eyes and sleeves rolled up as if he had been working since dawn. His desk was cluttered with files and coffee rings. Nothing about him looked intimidating, and for that, I was grateful. I opened the folder and slid the deeds, tax records, and the forged check across to him. My hands shook as I pushed the papers forward. "My niece," I said, my throat catching on the word. "She's trying to take my house." He studied the documents with a lawyer's patience, flipping each page carefully. I sat there, listening to the hum of the overhead light, the scratch of his pen as he made notes. My chest tightened as if I were awaiting a sentence. Finally, he leaned back. "Ma'am, your name is the only one on this deed. No one else has any claim. Not without a notarized recorded transfer. Those papers she gave you." He tapped the folder. "They mean nothing unless you sign them." Even then, they'd need to be filed at the recorder's office. "Has she done that?" "No," I whispered. "Then she has no power. The house is still yours entirely." The words washed over me like cold water. Relief sharp and bracing, but also humiliation that I had doubted myself so easily. I nodded, blinking hard. But she forged my name on checks. That, he said, is a separate matter. It's financial fraud. If you want to pursue it, we can. But as for your home, you are safe. Unless you sign something, no one can take it from you. Safe. The word clung to me like a bandage. I thanked him, collected my papers, and walked back into the bright morning. The courthouse clock chimed 11, each note reverberating against the stone buildings. My breath puffed in the cold air. For the first time in weeks, I lifted my head high as I crossed the square. Yet safety didn't feel like enough. Knowing the mansion was mine didn't ease the ache of betrayal. The house itself had become a battlefield, my niece circling like a hawk. Every creak of the floorboards felt like her footsteps, every shadow a reminder that she wanted what was not hers. That evening, I sat alone in the dining room, the table scattered with papers once again. The chandelier hummed overhead bulbs, flickering slightly. I thought of my parents eating here, my husband at the head of the table, laughter spilling between courses. Now only silence lived here. Silence and me. I stared at the walls, their wallpaper faded into a ghost of roses, and thought about what the lawyer had said. You are safe. But safety was not the same as peace. Peace required something else, an ending. The house had always been my duty, my prison, my shrine. I had clung to it because it was the last tether to those I loved. But tethering myself to walls had cost me pieces of my life I could never reclaim. Now those same walls had become a lure for greed. I pushed back my chair and walked the halls once more, but this time I wasn't lost in grief. I was taking measure. Every room I passed, every doorway I touched, I asked myself, what is this house really? Shelter-burdened memory. In the upstairs bedroom, I paused at the window. The yard stretched wide, bare trees, rattling against the sky. I imagined new voices filling these rooms, voices not of my blood, but of strangers who might love the space as fiercely as I once did. I imagined the echo of children's laughter, breaking the quiet, imagined footsteps not weighted with betrayal, but with possibility. The thought startled me. I hadn't let myself consider such a future, but the image lingered persistent and bright. The next day, I made a phone call. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I explained. I spoke to a woman who directed a nonprofit one that turned abandoned estates into transitional housing for women escaping violence. She listened closely, asking questions, her tone steady, kind. By the end of the conversation, my hands trembled less. She said she could walk through the property, discuss purchase. When I hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand. My niece wanted to flip the house for profit. I wanted to flip it for life. That night, I slept more deeply than I had since the funeral. My dreams were not of the past, but of open doors. Days later, the woman arrived. She was younger than me, maybe mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a soft coat buttoned against the cold. We walked through the rooms together, her hand brushing walls. Her voice low as she imagined what could be cribs in one room, study desks in another, a dining table filled with chatter. I followed her, listening. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel heavy. It felt like possibility. In the empty living room, she turned to me. It's beautiful, she said. We could make it a home again, for families who need one. I nodded, my throat tight. That's what I want. When she left, I stood in the foyer, hand pressed to the banister. The air smelled different, lighter. My niece's shadow still hovered in my mind, her laughter echoing. But the house itself seemed to hum with a new kind of anticipation. The lawyer had told me I was safe, but now I understood safety was just the beginning. The real victory was reclaiming the choice, turning the house into something she could never touch. Not money, not a trophy, but sanctuary. The decision sat in me like stone, solid and immovable. I would sell the house. Not to her, not to anyone like her, but to those who would fill the rooms with voices strong enough to drown her greed. The silence of betrayal had reached its end, and I was ready to answer it. The day she came back, the sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that made the house feel smaller, as though the clouds were pressing down on the roof. I had just finished sweeping the front porch when her car pulled into the drive. The tires crunched against the gravel with an air of ownership, as if she already believed this place belonged to her. She stepped out in her heels, bright red against the muted tones of the afternoon, and carried herself up the walkway with the confidence of someone collecting what was owed. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She opened the door and breezed in perfume trailing behind her like smoke. "Well, Auntie," she said, her smile thin, her eyes sharp. "When do I get the keys?" Her words sliced through the silence. For a moment, I stood with the broom still in my hand, bristles resting on the floorboards. I studied her face, the raised brow, the curl of her lips, the way she already looked past me as though inventorying the rooms. She had rehearsed this moment. She expected me to hand everything over as if grief had finally broken me down. I set the broom aside and walked slowly to the kitchen. "Tea?" I asked. My voice was even soft. She blinked clearly, taken off guard. "Tea? Yes. Sit down." Reluctantly, she did. She crossed her legs, tapping one heel against the tile. Her hand smoothed her skirt as though she were preparing for a meeting she already considered one. I filled the kettle, the water rushing loud against the metal sink. Steam soon hissed, curling into the air. I took my time, moving, deliberately pouring water into 2 cups, setting the table with mismatched mugs. One was chipped, the one I always used, the other a floral relic from my mother's cabinet. I slid the floral cup toward her. "Sugar," she waved a manicured hand dismissively. "No, thank you. I don't plan on staying long." She leaned back in the chair, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "I've already spoken to a realtor. This place could sell fast, but we'd get more if we did a few renovations first. Fresh paint, maybe knock out some walls. You'd be amazed what open concept does for value." Her words bounced off the walls like insults. Knock out some walls, as if history could be erased with a sledgehammer. I sipped my tea and said nothing. She leaned forward, smile brightening, as though she were sharing good news. "Honestly, Auntie, this is the best thing for you. You don't need all this space. We'll get you somewhere smaller, cozier. Maybe a retirement community. You'll thank me later." I watched the steam rise from my cup, curling upward like fragile threads. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. My silence unsettled her more than any argument would have. Her tapping heel grew louder against the tile. "Did you hear me?" she asked, irritation bleeding through her cheerful facade. I lifted my eyes, met hers, and smiled faintly. On the counter behind me, leaning against the wall, was the realtor's sign. The bold red letters blazed across the whiteboard, "Sold." Her gaze caught it, and I saw the exact moment her composure cracked. Her smile faltered. Her eyes widened, and then narrowed again in disbelief. She shot to her feet, nearly knocking the tea over. "What is that?" I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain clicking against the saucer. "It's done." "What do you mean it's done?" Her voice rose, sharp and trembling. "You can't, this house. It was supposed to." She sputtered, words colliding in her throat. "It was mine," I said quietly. "And now it belongs to someone else." She stared at me, horror twisting her features. You sold it, without telling me. I let the silence answer." Her hands shook, clenched at her sides. "You're insane, senile, No one will believe you knew what you were doing. Do you realize what you've done? You've ruined everything." Her voice ricocheted through the kitchen, but I didn't flinch. I remained seated calm, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Her anger, her insults rolled off me like water against stone. Finally, I said, "I chose peace over profit. You should try it sometime." She let out a strangled laugh, bitter and sharp. "Peace. You think selling the house is peace? You gave away our legacy. Do you even know what people will say about you?" I did know. I knew exactly what they would say, that she had tried to take what wasn't hers, that her greed had been exposed, that shame would follow her like a shadow. And I knew what they would say about me, that I had chosen dignity, that I had given the house a future, instead of letting it rot in her hands. Her voice cracked shrill. "You'll regret this." I rose slowly and gathered the cups, pouring the untouched tea into the sink. "No," I said, my back to her. "You will." The front door slammed so hard the frame rattled. The house seemed to exhale after she left, the silence settling like a blessing. I stood at the sink, hands braced against the counter, breathing deep. My heart beat steadily, no longer frantic. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't confused. I was steady-rooted like the old oak tree in the yard that had weathered every storm. The realtor's sign still leaned against the wall, bold and final. Sold. I wiped the cups dry, set them back in the cupboard, and whispered to the quiet kitchen, "It's over." But the truth was, it wasn't over. Not yet. Her words still lingered, venomous, echoing through the rooms. "You've ruined everything." She was wrong. I hadn't ruined anything. I had reclaimed it, and I had chosen silence as my weapon. The next morning, I found the voicemail waiting. My phone blinked with a single red light pulsing like a heartbeat. I pressed play, holding the receiver to my ear. Her voice spilled out shrill and venomous. "How could you? You've embarrassed me, humiliated me. Everyone knows you've lost your mind. People are saying you gave it away, that you don't even care about family. Do you know what they're calling me now? A fool? A fool because of you." There was a pause, the sound of her ragged breathing, then the final strike. "You'll die alone in that little apartment you think you want. And when you do, no one will care." The line clicked dead. I stood in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, though the message had ended. Outside, the sun was breaking through clouds, strips of gold cutting across the yard. The house was already in transition paperwork, filed, the nonprofit's plans in motion. It was no longer mine yet, for now, I was still its caretaker. Her words stung, but only for a moment. They carried no truth, only her desperation. I set the phone down and breathed deep. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. The mansion had always smelled that way, old, steady, unchanging. Later that day, I heard from the nonprofit's director. She spoke with quiet excitement, explaining the renovations they planned, how quickly the house would be filled with new families. "We'll take good care of it," she promised. "You've given us a gift." Her gratitude steadied me. For weeks, I had felt like the walls themselves pressed against my chest, suffocating me with memory. Now those same walls would breathe again. Not with my grief, but with new voices, new lives. Still, I couldn't shake the echo of my niece's laughter from the driveway, the cruel confidence with which she had declared, "It's basically mine already." I realized then that she hadn't wanted the house itself. She wanted the power of taking it from me. By selling it, I had robbed her of that power. That evening, I walked the halls slowly, the way I had done so many nights before. But this time, I wasn't weighed down by absence. The emptiness felt different, more like a pause than a loss, a breath held before something new. The wallpaper's roses glowed faintly in the lamplight, no longer wilted symbols, but quiet witnesses to change. I paused in the dining room, resting my hand on the table where generations had gathered. I thought of Sunday dinners, long gone, of candles flickering above roast beef of laughter that once made the chandelier tremble. My niece would never understand those layers, never feel the gravity of sacrifice and memory etched into every scratch. To her, the table was wood. To me, it was testament. I whispered, "It's time to let go." The words surprised me. They were not bitter, not heavy. They felt like release. A few days later, she came again. I heard the car, before I saw it, tires squealing against gravel, the slam of her door. I didn't move to greet her. I stayed seated on the porch, wrapped in a cardigan, watching sparrows dart across the yard. She stormed toward me, face flushed, eyes wild. "You've ruined my life," she screamed. "Do you understand? Everyone thinks I'm a thief now. Do you know what they're saying in town? That I tried to scam my own aunt? Do you realize what you've done to me?" I looked at her, her rage spilling like broken glass across the porch. She had always been composed, always curated, careful with appearances. Now she was unraveling. "You did that to yourself," I said simply. She froze, caught off guard by the calm in my voice. "What? You forged my name on checks. You spread lies. You treated me like I was invisible. You did this. Not me." Her face, twisted eyes darting as though searching for some crack in my words. But there was none. The truth was steady, undeniable. "You'll regret this," she spat. "One day you'll wish you'd given me the house. You'll see." I shook my head. "No. One day you'll wish you had chosen differently." She turned and stormed back to her car. Gravel sprayed as she sped away. I stayed on the porch, long after she was gone, the autumn air cool against my skin. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. For the first time in months, I felt still, grounded, unshakable. That night, I found myself standing in the empty master bedroom. The closet door was open, bare hangers clinking softly. I thought of my husband, of the life we built here, of how this room once smelled of his cologne and aftershave. The emptiness didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt honest. The house had served its purpose, and now it was ready for another. In the quiet, I heard the faintest sound laughter carried through the walls, though no one was there. I knew it wasn't real, but it felt like a promise. Soon, real children's voices would fill this space. Soon, the silence would be broken. I closed my eyes, letting that image settle into me. Not revenge, not triumph, renewal. When I opened them again, I whispered to the room, "It's yours now." I walked out, leaving the light off behind me. The mansion no longer belonged to me, but I carried no bitterness. I carried only a strange, quiet gratitude for the memories it had given me, for the strength it had forced me to find, for the peace of knowing it would live on in ways my niece could never imagine. Her insults still lingered, but they no longer clung. They were echoes fading into distance. The house was moving on, and so was I. The day of the closing came with bright, brittle sunlight, the kind that makes autumn leaves look like stained glass. I dressed simply, navy slacks, a cream sweater, the pearl earrings my mother once wore to church. Nothing extravagant, nothing funereal, just enough to feel like myself in a room that would mark the end of decades. At the lawyer's office, the conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights. Papers lay stacked neatly, pens waiting like instruments for a final performance. Across from me sat the nonprofit's director, her hands folded calmly, her smile kind. There was no trace of greed in her, no hunger. Just gratitude, plain and steady. The lawyer explained each page, his voice a steady hum, the legal language dense but clear enough. Deed transfer, closing statement, tax documents. I signed my name over and over, each stroke of the pen lighter than the last. With every signature, I felt a layer of weight lift off me, as if the house itself was loosening its grip on my chest. When it was done, the director extended her hand. "You've done something extraordinary," she said. "This house will be more than a shelter. It will be a home." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. My hand trembled only slightly as I shook hers. Walking out into the parking lot, the sunlight hit my face, sharp and clean. The air smelled of dry leaves and exhaust. I stood there for a moment, folder clutched to my chest, realizing the mansion was no longer mine. Legally, spiritually, practically, it belonged to others now. I thought I would feel hollow. Instead, I felt light. Still later that evening, I drove back to the house. The closing hadn't changed the physical reality. My things were still inside boxes, waiting to be packed, closets half empty. The porch light flickered as I climbed the steps, the bulb tired but still burning. Inside, the rooms greeted me with their familiar silence, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was transitional, like a train station waiting for new arrivals. The walls seemed to hum, holding their breath for the lives about to unfold within them. I walked through, slowly touching each doorway one last time. In the dining room, the chandelier swayed faintly, catching the lamplight. I remembered my parents' laughter here, my husband's hand resting on mine under the table. The echoes were sharp, but they didn't cut. They comforted. Upstairs, I lingered in the hallway, running my hand along the railing polished by decades of use. My footsteps creaked against the floorboards, each sound a memory released into the air. I paused at the window in the master bedroom, watching the yard below. A group of sparrows darted across the branches, settling, scattering, returning again. I whispered to the room, "Take care of them," as though the house could hear me. Perhaps it could. The next morning, movers arrived. They carried out the furniture piece by piece, the worn sofa, the dining chairs, my husband's recliner. Some items went to charity, others to storage, a few to my new apartment. I watched them work with quiet detachment, each item leaving like an old friend whose visit had ended. When the last box was loaded, I walked the empty halls once more. The house echoed differently now, louder, emptier. But it wasn't a cruel emptiness. It was readiness. I locked the door, slipped the key into an envelope, and placed it in the nonprofit director's hands. Her eyes shone with something close to reverence. "We'll honor this," she said. Driving away, I didn't look back right away, but at the edge of the street, I stopped the car and turned. The mansion stood tall against the fading sky, its windows glinting with late light. It didn't look abandoned. It looked expectant. I pressed my palm against the steering wheel and whispered, "Goodbye." That night, in my new apartment, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea. The city hummed around me, distant sirens, footsteps on the sidewalk, laughter from an open window across the street. It was smaller than the mansion, far smaller. But it was mine, entirely mine, without ghosts pressing against the walls. The loneliness I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange companionship in the noises around me, the world alive outside my door. For the first time in months, I didn't feel swallowed by silence. I thought of my niece then, of the venom in her voice, the shame she carried like a wound she couldn't hide. I knew she was still raging, still spinning her story to anyone who would listen. But I also knew the truth had already spread. She tried to steal and she failed. Her reputation was fractured, and I didn't need to lift a finger. The weight of revenge was heavy. I had chosen not to carry it. The weight of peace was lighter, though it demanded its own kind of strength. I sipped my tea and looked up at the night sky. For the first time in years, I saw a possibility instead of burden. The mansion had given me decades of life, and I had given it back to the world. That exchange felt fair. And in the stillness of my small apartment, I realized something profound. I hadn't lost a home. I had gained freedom. I didn't go back right away. After the movers had cleared out my belongings and the key had changed hands, I told myself I was done. The mansion had been a weight, and lifting it had taken everything I had. My new apartment was smaller, brighter, and filled with noise from the street below. I thought that was enough. But curiosity pulled at me like a thread. 2 months after the sale, I drove past the old house. It was dusk, the kind of evening when the sky turned violet at the edges and the street lamps buzzed awake. I slowed as I approached, my heart pounding, unsure if I had the courage to look. What I saw stopped me cold. The porch light was on, not flickering, but steady. A stroller leaned against the railing, small shoes lined neatly by the door. Through the front window, I caught glimpses of movement, a child running across the floor, a woman calling after him with laughter in her voice. The house was alive. I pulled to the curb down the street and cut the engine. I sat there in silence, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching. More lights flickered on inside, upstairs, in the dining room, down the hall. Shadows moved across the curtains, quick and playful. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. It pulsed with life. For years I had feared the house would become my tomb, a shrine to loss and obligation. Instead, it had become sanctuary. I imagined bunk beds in the rooms where my parents once slept, backpacks tossed in corners, where dust used to gather, laughter spilling down the staircase, where silence had reigned. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't heavy like before. They were light, sharp, almost cleansing. I didn't knock. I didn't want to intrude. I simply sat there until the chill of the night crept into the car, then started the engine again. As I drove away, I whispered to myself, "It's theirs now, and that's enough." Back at my apartment, I settled into my new rhythm. The space was modest: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a balcony just big enough for a chair and a potted plant. But it was manageable. It belonged to me without expectation, without memory pressing on every surface. Each morning, I made coffee in my husband's mug. It felt like a ritual, a tether not to grief, but to gratitude. I carried the mug to the balcony, sat in the chair, and watched the world unfold below me. Neighbors walking dogs, children waiting for the school bus, the hum of traffic. Life moved around me, and for once, I didn't feel left behind. Some nights were harder. Loneliness still crept in, sharp as a draft under the door. I'd hear echoes of my niece's voice in my head, the venom of her insults. Senile, old, alone. But then I'd remind myself her words were never about me. They were about her shame, her hunger, her need to control. She had tried to write my ending for me, but I had chosen my own. One Sunday afternoon, the nonprofit director called. "We've moved in 3 families," she said. "It's been incredible." The children love the yard. One of the mothers told me she hasn't felt safe in years until now. I closed my eyes, holding the phone close, letting her words wash over me. Safe. That was the word I had clung to, the one the lawyer had used months ago. But now, the house wasn't just safe for me, it was safe for others. That was the kind of legacy I could live with. A week later, I drove by again. This time, I parked closer. I sat in my car, watching as two children chased each other across the lawn, their laughter cutting through the crisp air. A woman stood on the porch phone, pressed to her ear, smiling. A laundry line stretched across the side yard, sheets fluttering like white flags of surrender. I realized then that I wasn't watching strangers. I was watching the continuation of everything I had carried. My sacrifices, my grief, my endurance, they had transformed into this. Life messy and loud and uncontainable. I didn't feel the need to introduce myself to explain who I was or what I had given up. The house no longer needed me, and that strangely was the greatest comfort. That night in my apartment, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't opened in years. Its cover was worn, pages yellowed at the edges. I wrote one line at the top of a blank page. This is not the story she wanted for me. My niece had wanted me erased, small, forgotten. Instead, I had written a different ending, one where silence became strength, where betrayal became clarity, where loss became a doorway to something larger than myself. I wrote until my hand cramped, spilling thoughts that had pressed against me for months. By the time I set the pen down, the notebook was half filled, my story taking shape in ink and breath. The next morning, I carried it to the balcony, reading over the words as the sun rose. The world outside buzzed awake, cars, voices, birdsong. I sipped my coffee and let the sounds mix with my own quiet narrative. The mansion no longer held me, it held others. And in that release, I finally felt free. Winter arrived quietly, dusting the streets with frost, softening the edges of everything. From the balcony of my apartment, I watched smoke curl from chimneys, children bundled in bright coats, kicking up snow as they laughed on their way to school. Life moved around me in its ordinary patterns, and I let myself be part of that ordinariness. It was new, almost fragile, this quiet life, without the mansion, without the constant pressure of defending it. But peace rarely arrives unchallenged. One morning, I received a phone call from a neighbor I had known for decades, a woman who used to sit with me after church potluck sipping coffee in my kitchen. Her voice was tentative, uncomfortable. "I thought you should know," she said softly. "Your niece has been talking, at the diner, at the beauty parlor. She says you're unwell, that you didn't understand what you were doing when you sold the house." I closed my eyes, the words sinking like stones into my chest. Even after everything, she was still clawing, still spinning her story to anyone who would listen. "I'm sorry," my neighbor continued. "I didn't believe her. But others, they whisper. You know how small towns are." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. The apartment was warm, the radiator humming softly, but inside me a chill spread. Her voice echoed in my head, senile, old, alone. For years, I had believed silence was protection, that if I said nothing, truth would speak for itself. But now her lies were louder than my quiet. And yet I knew that shouting back would only drag me into her arena where anger fed on itself. So I turned to something else. I opened my notebook, the one I had started weeks earlier, and began to write. Page after page, I told the story as it had unfolded, not the version she spread, but mine, the truth unvarnished. I wrote of the funeral, of the papers she had pushed across my table, of the forged checks, of the realtor's card wedged in my door. I wrote of the silence I had chosen at the kitchen table when she demanded keys, of the way her face cracked when she saw the sold sign. Writing gave me something her lies could never take ownership. Each page was a reclamation. Some days, the words came fast, pouring out of me until my hand ached. Other days, I could only manage a sentence or two. But slowly, the notebook filled line after line, memory after memory. By the end of January, it was nearly full, a testimony no whisper could erase. One afternoon, I visited the library near my apartment, a place I hadn't stepped into since my husband's illness. The air smelled of paper and possibility. I sat at a wooden table, spreading my notebook wide, and copied passages onto fresh pages. Around me, college students tapped at laptops, children chattered in hushed tones, an older man dozed in a corner. The ordinariness of it steadied me. As I wrote, I imagined someone finding these words long after I was gone. They would read and know that I had not been confused, that I had not surrendered my life. They would see the truth not in court filings or gossip, but in my own hand. It wasn't revenge. It was survival in ink. That evening, back on my balcony, I sipped tea and watched the first snowflakes of the season drift down. The notebook sat beside me, heavy but comforting. My niece's lies still circulated, but they no longer had the same sting. Her words were just noise. I had given the house to life, and I had given myself to honesty. A week later, I drove by the mansion again. The yard was covered in snow footprints scattered across the path like constellations. A child in a red coat dragged a sled up the hill by the driveway, while another slid down, shrieking with laughter. Curtains glowed warm from inside, silhouettes moving busy and alive. I stayed in the car engine, humming, watching as the house thrived in ways I could never have imagined. The sight filled me with something deeper than peace, something close to joy. As I turned the car around, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was lined, my hair streaked with silver, but my eyes looked steady, clear. Not confused, not weak, simply alive. I whispered to myself, "Let her talk." The mansion had already spoken louder. February brought longer light, the kind that lingered in the late afternoon and stretched shadows across my apartment walls. I found myself waking earlier, brewing coffee before the sun had fully risen, carrying my husband's mug to the balcony, where frost still clung to the railing. The mornings were crisp, but they no longer bit the way they once had. They felt like a clean slate. The apartment was small, but it became mine in ways the mansion never had. I arranged books on shelves, placed framed photos on the table by the window. Without cavernous halls and endless rooms to maintain, I found myself breathing easier. No creaks haunted the night, no echoes of arguments or silence pressed on my chest. The space asked nothing of me but to live in it. Sometimes I missed the garden. I missed the way the hydrangeas bloomed heavy in July, how my husband and I had once sat on the porch in folding chairs watching lightning bugs pulse across the yard. Memory was tender that way, sweet and cutting at once. But I learned to grow herbs in small pots on the balcony, basil, rosemary, thyme. They thrived in their containers, compact and purposeful. Like me, my niece's shadow still brushed the edges of my days. I'd hear from neighbors occasionally whispers about what she was saying now, that I had been manipulated, that I'd acted out of spite, that I was a bitter old woman punishing family for imagined slights. I listened, then let it pass, because the truth was visible to anyone who cared to see. The mansion was no longer empty. It was alive. 3 families had made it their home, and more were waiting for a chance. The nonprofit sent me updates, sometimes photos of children drawing at the dining table, a newborn cradled in the upstairs bedroom, where my mother once rested, a group of women painting the living room walls a soft yellow. Every photo was a rebuke to my niece's lies. One Saturday, I drove by again. Snow had melted, leaving patches of brown grass and mud. A basketball hoop leaned against the garage, its net torn but still swaying in the wind. I parked at the end of the street and sat quietly watching. A boy shot hoops with clumsy determination, missing more than he made. A girl younger sat on the steps, tying the laces of her two big shoes. Their mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the chill, smiling as she called them in for dinner. The scene was ordinary, but it broke something open inside me. All those years, I had believed the house belonged to memory, to the weight of sacrifice and grief. Yet here it was reinvented. It didn't need me to keep it alive. It needed life itself. I stayed until the porch light blinked on, then drove away, my chest lighter than it had been in years. Back in my apartment, I opened my notebook again. The pages were nearly full now, but I wasn't finished. That night, I wrote about sacrifice, not just mine, but my mother's, my father's, even my husband's. How each of us had given pieces of ourselves to keep the family steady, and how sometimes those sacrifices were overlooked, dismissed, or even mocked. I wrote about how betrayal could twist love into something jagged, but also how clarity could rise from the wreckage. When I read back what I had written, I realized it wasn't just my story anymore. It was a record of resilience, a map of how to survive the people who tried to erase you. One passage stood out to me. She thought she was taking the house from me, but she never understood that the house was only ever a vessel. What mattered was the choice, and that choice was mine, not hers. For the first time, I believed it fully. In March, I bumped into an old acquaintance at the grocery store. She leaned close, lowering her voice. "Your niece?" she whispered. "She's been telling folks you'll regret what you did." I smiled, placing apples into a bag. "She regrets it enough for the both of us." The woman blinked, then laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. But I didn't need her approval. The truth stood on its own, steady and unshaken. That evening, I sat on my balcony as the sun set, the horizon painted in streaks of pink and orange. The herbs I'd planted released their fragrance into the cooling air. I thought of my niece again, not with anger, not even with pity, but with a strange kind of distance. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Her inheritance was shame. Mine was peace. The mansion had taught me something I hadn't expected. Letting go was not the same as losing. Sometimes letting go was the only way to reclaim yourself. And in my quiet apartment, with the hum of the city below and the notebook heavy on my lap, I realized I was no longer waiting for life to happen to me. I was living it one page, one breath, one small act of defiance at a time. Spring came early that year. The air softened the trees along my street, unfurled tender green leaves, and the sidewalks filled with the sound of bicycles rattling past. I opened my apartment windows and let the breeze wander through the rooms, carrying with it the smell of fresh earth. One morning, as I watered the herbs on my balcony, I overheard two women talking on the sidewalk below. Their voices drifted up like gossip always does, uninvited, unavoidable. "Did you hear about her?" one said. "Oh, yes," the other replied, lowering her voice. "The niece. Imagine trying to cheat your own aunt like that. People don't forget things like this." I froze, watering can suspended in my hand. For a moment, I felt the old shame threaten to rise again, the familiar sting of being talked about instead of spoken to. But then I listened closer. "She's ruined her own reputation," the first woman continued. "Can't even show her face at church anymore. Everyone knows." Their footsteps faded down the street, leaving silence in their wake. I set the watering can down and leaned against the balcony rail. For months, I had carried her insults like scars, carved under my skin. But here, in the open air, I heard the truth. At last, her shame had finally overtaken her lies. I thought about her, about the way she had strutted into my kitchen with papers in hand, convinced of her triumph. I thought about her shrill voice in that voicemail, calling me senile, declaring I would die alone. But the reality was simpler, crueler. She had destroyed herself. I didn't feel satisfaction, not exactly. Just a calm acknowledgement, like watching a storm pass without needing to step outside. That evening, I walked to the library again. I carried my notebook pages, now thick with ink margins crowded with thoughts I hadn't dared to say aloud. I sat at the same wooden table as before, spreading the book open, and added one more line. Her shame was never my burden to carry. It felt like closing a door. Weeks later, I visited the mansion one final time. I parked at the end of the street, as I always did, not wanting to intrude. The trees in the yard had burst into bloom, white blossoms cascading like soft snow. Children's toys were scattered across the lawn, plastic cars, a tricycle, a ball half buried in the grass. The porch railing gleamed with a new coat of paint, fresh and bright. Through the windows, I saw the flicker of television light, heard the faint hum of voices. The house looked not just occupied, but cherished. I stayed only a few minutes, long enough to memorize the sight, long enough to feel the last threads between me and that place loosen and fall away. Then I drove home. Back at the apartment, I placed the notebook on the shelf beside my bed. I didn't need to add more. The story was complete. One night in late May, I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting on the porch of the mansion, legs crossed, reading the paper as though no time had passed. When he looked up at me, his eyes held pride, not sorrow. He folded the paper and said, "You did right." I woke with tears on my face, but they were soft, not jagged. Dreams had a way of saying what real words couldn't. I went about my days with a steadiness I hadn't known in years. Morning coffee afternoons at the library, evenings, listening to the hum of the city. I was no longer haunted. I was present. Occasionally, whispers about my niece would reach me, rumors of financial trouble, friendships, lost jobs that didn't last. Each time, I felt the urge to wince, to wonder if I should feel pity. But then, I remembered the sneer in her voice, the contempt in her eyes, and I chose distance. Her downfall was hers alone. My life had moved on. The last time someone mentioned her name to me, I simply smiled and said, "That chapter is closed." And it was. For so long, I had believed the mansion defined me, my duty, my sacrifice, my inheritance. But as I sat on my balcony one quiet evening, the city lights twinkling like fireflies below, I realized it had only ever been a backdrop. The real story was me. I had been betrayed, yes. I had been wounded, mocked, underestimated. But I had also reclaimed myself, word by word, choice by choice. The mansion had gone on to new life, and so had I. The air that night was cool, carrying the scent of rain. I lifted my face to the breeze and whispered, "I am free." And for the first time in decades, I believed it without doubt. Summer settled in slow and heavy, the kind of heat that pressed against windows and lingered in the evenings long after the sun had gone. From my balcony, I watched the city shift with the seasoned children darting through sprinklers, couples eating ice cream on corners, the steady hum of cicadas rising into the night. I had thought peace would come as a sudden arrival, like a door flung open, or a burden dropped all at once. Instead, it came quietly woven into small routines, watering the herbs each morning, carrying my groceries up the narrow stairs, pausing to smile at neighbors as we passed in the hall. Each act was simple, but each reminded me that life could be steady, without the weight of legacy pressing on my shoulders. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking of the mansion, not with grief, not with longing, but with a kind of tender distance. It stood somewhere out there, filled with families I didn't know, but somehow trusted. I imagined children racing down its long hallway, mothers leaning against door frames with relief in their eyes, meals shared at the dining table, where I had once set plates for my parents. The image no longer hurt. It warmed me. One evening, I drove past it for the last time. The yard was bright with flowers, the porch swept clean bicycles leaning against the rail. Through the open windows drifted the sound of laughter, clear, unguarded, alive. I pulled to the curb and sat quietly, letting the sound wash over me. I thought of the woman I had been the day my niece slid those papers across my kitchen table. Shaken raw, nearly convinced that I was powerless. I thought of the nights I had walked the empty halls in bare feet, listening to echoes of loss and betrayal. And then I thought of this moment sitting in the car outside the same house and feeling nothing but release. I whispered, barely audible even to myself. It was never about the house. It was always about me. And I knew it was true. The house had been memory-burdened sanctuary battlefield, but I was the one who had survived it. I was the one who had chosen differently. And because of that choice, the rooms no longer echoed with grief. They rang with possibility. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. I simply placed my hand against the steering wheel, nodded once, and drove away. I knew in my bones it was the last time I would ever see it. Back at my apartment, I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window as dusk deepened. The air smelled faintly of rain, and somewhere down the block a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. For years I had carried the weight of extraordinary burdens. Ordinary was what I had longed for all along. I took my notebook from the shelf and read the final line I had written weeks before. Her shame was never my burden to carry. Below it, I wrote one last sentence. I am more than what was taken from me. I closed the notebook, placed it gently on the table, and sat back. The story was finished, not just on paper, but in me. As the night unfolded, I thought of my parents, of my husband, of the decades spent inside walls that no longer belonged to me. I thought of the sacrifices made and the betrayals endured. And then I thought of the freedom I now carried, the kind that comes not from holding tighter, but from letting go. Peace, I realized, is not loud. It is not triumph shouted from rooftops. It is a quiet room where you can breathe without fear. It is a balcony filled with herbs, a mug of coffee cradled in the morning light, the sound of strangers' laughter rising from a house you no longer need to defend. It is knowing you have written your own ending. And as I turned off the lamp and let darkness settle around me, I felt it at last, stillness soft and steady, the kind that holds you like an embrace. Some treasures had been recovered. Others, more valuable, still had been discovered for the first time. It wasn't the ending I had expected. It was better, harder, clearer, more honest. It was mine. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.